Please welcome to the stage Vice Chair of the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation, Chelsea Clinton, and the Leveraging Digital Platforms to Promote Health panel members, Michael Maness, Dane Atkinson, CEO SumAll, Travis Bogard, Vice President, Product Management and Strategy, Jawbone, Kathy Chang, Founder, Moro, Clinton Foundation Codeathon winner, and Peter Tippett, MD, PhD, Chief Medical Officer, Vice President of Innovation Incubator, Verizon.
Great, thank you, Voice of God. And thank you all for ignoring the beautiful weather outside and joining us for this conversation this afternoon at Clinton Health Matters. I urge everyone following us online to please tweet questions and include the hashtag HealthMatters2014. And we're going to start this panel a little bit differently than the other ones that you have already listened to this morning. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to tell you effectively why they're here today on this stage, talking about leveraging digital platforms to promote health. And I'm going to give Michael a break since he was our warm-up act and ask Peter to start.
Verizon is interested in health in part because we're all human beings, and we have this concept we call shared success. And we're not going to be any more successful unless we can raise all boats. And what boat needs more raising in the world in America than the health boat? Not just health care, but preventative medicine and so on. So we've been looking for things that go beyond the network. Obviously, we're pretty good at mobility and networks and whatnot. But what are the big problems that we can do that can accelerate all of the businesses and companies and startups and codeathons and whatnot out there? So we've spent a lot of energy figuring out where the resistance is in this digital transformation. One of those things, for example, is figuring out privacy and getting it right, and the HIPAA compliance regulations, and the FDA compliance, and the data transmission from one format to another, and these other kinds of problems. These sorts of things make getting data shared between providers very difficult. They make it hard for you to figure out. I mean, if your provider wanted to send a message to your daughter to tell them that you were in trouble, they wouldn't know that that daughter had the permission of you. And so managing things like privacy permissions is something that ought to be done at scale worldwide. So we've got several platforms that are organized to basically accelerate the whole ecosystem.
Thank you, Travis.
Yeah, I'm really excited where we stand today because I think we've been flying blind, and it's hard to improve on something that you can't measure. And I think we're really at a point in time where we can leverage these digital platforms to really both understand what's going on and improve and have positive impact on health in real time. And so, a few examples of that. We're for the first time seeing that we can actually get consumers and mainstream wearing and tracking themselves and understanding their health and their lifestyle. And that's where we started out with a product called Up that's a combination of a band that you wear around your wrist and an application on your phone that together help people understand how they're moving, how they're sleeping, how they're eating, and how they're feeling, really with the idea of closing that gap that exists between intention and action. And then that flows in the second piece, which is, we're not alone. We're not the only ones coming up with solutions. And so we've been creating a platform so that people can come together and great ideas can foster and work together. And that's what we've been doing with the Health Matters and the Code for Health series. And great applications like what Kathy's going to talk about here in a minute, coming out of that really help people start to track and understand themselves. And that feeds into what I'm probably the most excited about is the opportunity of this data to really help public health, for us to really, for the first time, start to understand what's going on out there in a very real-time basis. We've had studies. Studies have been great in what's really guided us to this point, but the challenge has been they've often been with 100 people, maybe 1,000 people, and usually a few years after the fact. What we can start to do now is actually see that in real time and see what's going on. So I'll give one quick example of this. We looked at the events of 2013 and said, which of these events affected sleep? And one of the things that we found was the terrible Boston Marathon bombings. What we found was the night after those bombings, on average, people in the Boston area lost 19 minutes of sleep. Then the next nights of the manhunt and the MIT shootings, the people in Somerville and Cambridge lost 30 minutes of sleep and spent an extra 15 minutes sitting in bed, likely watching the news. And then when the suspects were apprehended, they ended up recovering 24 minutes a night of sleep. And so we really were able to see this in real time. Now, on a lighter note, we looked up Miley Cyrus's twerking. No one lost sleep over that. So that's a good thing. But if you think about what this really does for us, we can really start to leverage these platforms to understand in real time what's going on. So if we run a public health campaign, is it working? If we slightly change the message, is it working better? And I believe that if we had this information when we were taking sidewalks out of neighborhoods, would we have waited, decades later to have conversations like this, or change policies right after the first neighborhood? So I think it can have a really lasting impact for how we actually think about really managing health and scaling these solutions out there.
Great. Thank you, Kathy.
Sure. So as Travis mentioned, I was part of a team that won a Codeathon last November. And the Codeathon series has just been so inspiring to me because it really gives developers and designers who are passionate about social change a forum to meet and really try to impact health and benefit the world. So my app that we built was called Moro. It's an app that helps you track your water intake. And we chose to do that because it's a very simple behavioral change, and behavioral research has shown that simple changes are often the most likely to stick. But drinking enough water is a huge deal. Minor dehydration has been linked to fatigue, bad moods, even actually poor results on cognitive tests. But according to the CDC, 44% of Americans don't drink enough water. If you drink 1 glass of water with each meal, that actually means that you're getting 1/3 the amount that you need. Yeah, exactly. And, actually, that's what's really fun about this product because, we built it for the Codeathon, and so many people came up to us afterwards saying, hey, I really need this app. Can you please build it? That my team and I, who we just met at the Codeathon, were like, yeah, this is something that we can use our skills to really benefit people. And even our friends who we just told about this are like, hey, man, I'm drinking more water, and I think I have younger skin, so it's awesome. So it's really been a lot of fun. We definitely benefit from the platforms that Dane at SumAll and Travis at Jawbone and these different companies that are creating. So we can access their APIs and pull the data, not only get insights from the research, but also bring it back down to user-level data so we can make specific recommendations like, hey, you walked 50% more today, and you had a couple drinks of alcohol, so why don't you drink more water? So that's really cool. And it's just so inspiring to be part of this community of entrepreneurs who are really interested in changing the world, to have access to these platforms, to have technologies like wearables and like mobile devices that are ever present that can really make you motivated to have behavioral change, and just having technology that's cheaper and easier than ever so that we can test our ideas and collaborate around them.
Thank you. Dane?
Thanks, Chelsea. Thank you, CHMI, and thank you guys all out there for changing the world. This is freaking awesome to be here. So SumAll is a data analytics company. It's a big data company. It's the category leader for self-created data analytics. It has 100-some thousand businesses doing 500 billion points of data. And we were a little different as well. We decided that when we started, because we've done this a few times, that we would try to bind our DNA of goodness into the company structure. So when we created the company, we created a foundation at the same time. And we gave 10% of the main company to the foundation. A little inside trading, and that's allowed us to capitalize and make it work. And we've seen a lot of other startups embracing this kind of idea, and we think that it's not just a matter of the big companies, but the small companies, and all of us can sort of help move this thing forward. When we found the Clinton Foundation, it was a soul match. We cried and hugged. It was awesome because you guys are.
I didn't even ask him to say that.
You'll pay me later.
In water.
Done. You guys are definitely the biggest match we've seen out there dealing with a lot of nonprofits in the sense that you're aggressive, you embrace that startup mentality. What we wanted in our foundation was the idea of using data analytics to affect a lot of things in a meaningful way, which it always does, and to try to bind that startup mentality as well. So with the Clintons, we've been working on the idea of the prescription drugs, which if any of you guys saw that speech earlier, you should all be crying somewhere in a corner because it's terrifying. And we think that even at the beginning, just organizing all that data, creating an open data platform where everyone can put that in one place and raising the frequency so you can see what's actually happening and then visualizing that is a massive step. And surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, governments and organizations tend to not share their data as fast. So it takes an aggressive player like the Clintons to sort of allow folks like us to grab that data and make it available to everybody. And then after that, connecting the data, putting it together, putting in social data, putting in weather data, finding other patterns, and finding places where we can really change things works. We've seen it with homelessness. We've seen it with human trafficking. You can get the city to prevent someone from being homeless by spending $1,000 the day before they get evicted instead of waiting 2 weeks until they're out. And the data is there to see it. The data is there to see everything. You just have to sort of bring it together. So we're thrilled to be part of it.
Thank you. Michael?
Sure. So what's interesting for us is that we've actually been involved with data in different ways over the course of a number of years, and it's been very important. But being primarily centered around journalism, journalists and people who in the media tend to geek out on data sets that no one else cares about. So what we found as we were having different data explorations is that anything that kind of crossed the health or wellness area had a much higher use rate. And what we're really hoping for not only is this really valuable information, but it also teaches people what the power of data is, both the data sets that are locked behind walls, but that you as an individual become a data contributor and a data user. And what we're hoping with this is that the utility of what this means, and it is a very personal thing, that you get used to using data sets and see how powerful they can be in your life. So in a sense, the health data becomes the first step of multiple steps to say, if you do this, then we can look at things like the environmental impact, data sets that you can use around education or other aspects of your local community. And so we were really excited to see that, and what we think we're really hopeful for is the use, the immediate and personal use of this data and understanding how this works starts you on a pathway as a citizen that starts making you excited and finding high utility and using data for yourself, your family, and the community.
Great, thank you, and thank you all. I'm going to start off by talking about equity. It's something that Patrick talked about on this morning's panel, and it has sort of been a thread through different conversations we've been having here over the last day. How do you think digital platforms can help leapfrog so many of the barriers to access, whether it be access to good information, like you were talking about, access to systems like yours, Peter, access to apps that would really help them, access to understanding kind of where their data point is in the big mega sets that you work on, Dane, and access to technology like yours, Travis, which often is cost prohibitive to people. How can digital platforms really help ameliorate so many of the kind of what I'll call equity access barriers to health and to healthcare that so many people in our country face?
Well, you know, healthcare as an industry is dead last in the use of information technology. We're pretty much first in the use of technology. You can swallow a pill and get a video of your intestines, but we don't use cloud computing in healthcare. Doctors don't actually communicate with each other digitally. We have $10 billion a year are spent on dictation, creating 4 billion documents a year, less than 1% of which stay digital.
We spend $10 billion a year on dictation.
And less than 1% of those stay digital after they get to the first doctor. They go on paper, they go on fax, they don't get it to the next place. It's just horrible.
So like mid-20th century.
It's really bad, yeah. And so platforms like Evity are really powerful because, you know, we bridged the gap that was bridged in finance 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And, you know, one of the reasons we think in Verizon that one of the reasons we use communication so little in healthcare, it seems like we use it well, but, you know, every time you walk into an office and get that clipboard again, you realize that you've filled that out 6 times so far this year. Why on earth can't somebody, you know, make it available again for the next person? But, you know, Evity figures out the literature and merely gives the information to the doctor to make the right decisions. It's pretty straightforward stuff. It's just wild that we don't do it. And so to the extent that we can accelerate getting healthcare to use technology the way banking does, that's a big thing. And then what this panel mostly represents is the opposite end of that spectrum. We've got us the app-driven world where the consumers are driving the change at the resistance of doctors and hospitals and everybody else. So I think that we're going to have the Affordable Care Act and the High-Tech Act, which came 3 or 4 years earlier, which was driving digital transformation and meaningful use in healthcare. That's trying to force doctors and hospitals to use digital things. I think the patients, when they come with their apps and their phones and their Google lookups and their this and that, they're dragging in the other direction, and the two combined will cause this transformation to really happen.
Travis?
I think it ultimately comes down to effectively scaling and efficiently scaling, because we can't throw people at every one of these problems. If we want to go drive behavior change, we really don't have the resources to help everyone have a consultation around that. And so, we can really use these digital platforms to push that out at scale, both at a information level of what's going on, but also at a feedback loop, because really behavior is a sum of thousands of decisions we make throughout the day. And I had this discovery one day. We did some data research, and we found that on average, people who said they slept with a partner were going to bed 35 minutes earlier than other people. I connected that, than the people who didn't sleep with a partner, and I connected that to myself. Probably the most important health question I'm asked, and I'm asked this every night, and I never thought about it as a health question, was my wife, about to go up to bed, she says, "Are you coming up now, or do you still have more work to do?" And that's a difference of me going to bed 3 hours earlier or not. And so learning and seeing that happen actually from a data perspective, that question prompting people means that we can then roll it out as a digital solution. We can actually plant that type of seed in front of people. And we're seeing the early stages of that actually working, where we did a test where we found that people on Thanksgiving generally do what you would expect. They don't move around as much. They're watching football, eating a lot. And we basically went to those people and we said, try to make today like any other day, and just do what you normally would do. And the people opted into that got double-digit percentage increase of steps that day. So we're finding ways to really just help this scale out in a way that you didn't need a doctor or a wellness coach or whomever have to touch every single one of those people. We could do that at scale with tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of people.
Sure, Kathy.
Yeah, so I think that there are two ways that entrepreneurs are addressing this, directly and indirectly. And what's super exciting about entrepreneurship is if you make the data available, people use it in creative ways you've never even thought of. So directly, like, as you mentioned earlier, it can really democratize information. So there's apps like Health Tap, for example, where you can ask real doctors questions and they respond to you. So you don't need to go in for a consultation, and you have faster responses. And indirectly, one of my favorite friends is starting a company that basically collects data about factory workers in Bangladesh and in other areas. And so it has a business in that, a lot of these factories want to, or a lot of the contractors want to know how are these workers being treated. But he's making that value through collecting data about it. So in that way, indirectly, although these Bangladeshi workers are not using any sort of app, they're really benefiting from the fact that these data platforms are being created.
And Dane, what do you think from a big data perspective? How can kind of all of the correlations that we were briefly talking about backstage help empower people who've historically been disempowered over their health?
So I think that it's important to know that the big data is a myth. It is not that hard to get your hand on it. When we look at institutions we run into, they don't have data analysts. It's crazy. There is no commercial entity out there that doesn't have squadrons of data analysts optimizing their businesses. It doesn't happen out in the nonprofit sector. It doesn't happen in the healthcare sector. It's an easy fix. And from the interconnected data, even when we started working with you guys, we found that if you're in a college and you look up the Twitter handles of your students, they'll say, I'm going to go buy Yellow Jackets or Reds, which is them buying prescription drugs. The data is not far away. You just have to actually look at it. Tracking people's Twitter accounts does not require anything but a 23-year-old guy in a corner. The barrier is not that hard. Just start doing it, and you can find information out there. There are connections. Sorry.
No, please, preach, Michael.
I think the other aspect of it, as you see, is the ubiquity of mobile. We'll do a lot of that in the divide. So we talked a lot about the impact of what the internet and the digital revolutions are, but you're seeing it especially internationally, where people are leapfrogging over internet things and going right into mobile applications. And the fact that your mobile device or devices or wearables actually help you become a generator of data and not just a consumer of data, I think is a very revolutionary moment for that, and taking advantage of that from both a consumption standpoint for the consumer as well as allowing things like this to generate data all the time will help us map those types of things. So the fact that you can geolocate with that and that you can actually timestamp what's going on, all of those things contribute to a much better sense of what the overall community is doing. So you don't have to wait for someone to go to the doctor to do that. You don't have to wait for for a study to come along every 5 to 10 years to understand what's happening. So
how do patients, consumers, find not only the information they need to understand kind of their health in a given moment of time, but also to be informed with what are the easy behavior changes that they need to make first? I mean, we talked last night and earlier today about the chronic disease burden in our country, and there are so many comorbidities that often, particularly older, but sadly, as we discussed last night, increasingly younger Americans face. How can digital platforms help empower people to know, like, first I need to change my diet, then second, maybe I need to walk more, then third, maybe, I need to call my doctor more, so that it's not an overwhelming diagnosis, but instead sort of an empowering game plan? Any thoughts on that, Travis?
So I think there's the obvious solution, which is content can be targeted and directed to people, and that becomes a very scalable thing to go do. But I think the less obvious is something we talked about at the Codeathon, which is it's really about sparking conversations. So we can actually share what we're learning and bringing it up to the surface of where we spend time during our dinners and our lunch breaks and water cooler conversation. That what are the tips that allow me to be up moving around at the same time I'm getting work done? One of the tips I shared with the Codeathon participants this past week was I discovered one day that I got a tremendous amount of steps, and it turned out when I looked when those happened, it was all when I was on a conference call. And so now every time I do a conference call, I pace around the office. 3 phone calls, I'm at 10,000 steps. It's really that easy. But that's something that as soon as I've shared with other people, they then start doing the same thing. And so in many ways, these digital platforms allow us, and the social networks that exist, allow us to spark that conversation where we're talking more than just the latest TV show we saw or the latest cool app to download, but we're talking about things that can really just be the simple little tips that help us live healthier lives.
Michael?
Something to build on that is that we saw both overall and the people applying for the contest and something that was uncovered with it is people who have chronic or very deep conditions. It's hard for them to relate to anyone in their family. They might have empathy from their family, but it creates this moment that we saw that a need to have this network of intimate strangers, people who are sharing the things you're going through. And in a way that no one else can understand unless you have that condition. And it was really remarkable how very specific chronic diseases or conditions had people wanting to build apps for those. So you would know where you're at, both in the trajectory of what you're experiencing, but also to find somebody online that's outside of your community that really you can understand and have a communication with. So I think that I was really struck this morning around the notion of the person being lonely in the house.
That
right?
may help ameliorate the loneliness.
Exactly, yeah.
That's
Peter?
a perfect segue because we see exactly that problem. How do you make social networking work? One of the things you have to do is empower or facilitate anonymity. Right, you need to be able to say, this people have myasthenia gravis, we know for sure they do.
Even if Dane is looking at all your data.
Yeah, or if they say they're a doctor, they really are. The app you were talking about earlier, if somebody said you'd be better off if you took 1,000 units of insulin, well, that will kill you, right? So, it'd be nice to know for sure that the person was a doctor or that the person you're talking to really does have myasthenia gravis, or whatever the disease is. But otherwise they're anonymous, and somehow we can enforce that. One of the platforms we built and brought out is called Universal Identity, and what it's organized around is enabling those next phases. So we've got a platform called Converged Health Management that lets you get the gizmo data, like your glucose readings or your blood pressure or those things, up into a cloud and off to your doctor. but your doctor doesn't want 5,000 gizmo readings a day, right? It needs to get massaged. It needs to turn into an action. It needs to turn into something that could wind up coming back. And the best way to do that, maybe, for some people at least, is to enable a community of like-minded people.
And Peter, and this is also for the rest of the panel, how do we ensure that older people who are decidedly not digital natives are equally taking advantage of the resources that are developing, some organically through these social networks like what Michael was talking about, some through apps or products like what Kathy and Travis are engaged in doing? How do we help ensure there's not a sort of socioeconomic gap on one level, but also a generational gap on another level?
I think I need to ask who here does not have parents and grandparents, right? So we don't have to look very far to figure out that the Luddites of the world are in our own family, and we're the tech support for them, right? And so you go to my mother, and I'm going to go on the way home and stop by to install a new VCR for her, right? Because there's 3 wires to hook up, right? So it's exactly right. She's not about to use a smartphone unless that smartphone was easy as the button in the car when you push it, somebody says, "Can I help you?" right? And so I see a whole movement coming where we address that, the social network of people and their community at an uber simple level, where you hide all the applications on a smartphone. The only thing there is one button. And the only thing it does is hook you to someone who says, "How can I help you?" And those people are perhaps volunteers who can help hook you up to your church group or your sewing group or your neighbor or your son or whatever it is, and have them show up at your dinner table. There's all kinds of interesting things like that that let communication work even for people who are complete Luddites in the world.
It's the audio version of the crisis text line in some ways.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's where you get into the potential of mobile doing SMS, simple messaging, those types of things where you can, there's someone to call, there's a database that responds to you. All of those things, you don't have to have high tech. The key on a lot of that, though, is, and I think this is a struggle, is disseminating it to those target audiences so they know that they're fairly marginalized. So how do you use existing platforms? And
yeah, you can ring the home phone, and you can say, Betty, I noticed that you didn't take your meds today. Please do that. Whatever you do, whether it's wearables or otherwise, the communication back does not need to be as complex as we're trying to make it, especially for the underserved.
Travis, did you want to?
Yeah, I think the theme here a little bit is simplify. I think for those of us who create things, it's about making sure that we're highly focused on the problem we're trying to solve, who that audience is, and get rid of all the technology. I think very often we focus a lot on the technology because it's something that's cool that we can create, but at the end of the day, the technology should disappear, and we should just solve these problems in the easiest ways. And sometimes it might be ringing the home phone. And sometimes it might be a nice, beautiful app, but really, if we're designing for that user, it becomes really easy if we just simplify down to that problem.
Well, that's a good segue, I think, in some ways, to our question from livestream, Siddhartha. How can we change big data into smart data? Dane?
So again, big data is a tough term because big data is almost a problem. Smart data is what we're all shooting for, is behavioral change, trying to get things out of it. And I think that the foundation of that is making sure the data is connected and transparent, because before you even take that first step, you have to have it all in one place so that you can actually look at it and analyze it and put some human intelligence to it. And then it's going for the small victories. It's looking for ways that you can create simple behavioral changes that are on top of that data that can be influencing actual victories, as we heard from our exercise routine, that sort of get you hooked into the next victory and then victory thereafter. And I think that even to the past point, we can't expect that the market itself is going to fix the problem, that people with chronic diseases are going to find the answer, or the old person is going to figure out how to get there with the technology. It's unforgivable that the issue leaders aren't using technology to micro-target that person sitting at home, depressed or with whatever problem, and then reaching out and figuring out how to get there. They still have a digital footprint. They can be found. They can be isolated and helped.
Travis, you talked earlier about kind of what you had noticed at Jawbone following two very different but very real connected tragedies in Boston. What did you think you should then do with those insights? And who did you think was the right kind of partner to utilize those insights?
So In that particular case, I think it's really about starting to see that we have a real-time pulse, that we can see what's going on. I think if you start to see that that was a prolonged period of time, you would start to ask questions about what's going to happen with this group of people. How do we get ahead of that? You know, are there things that we should start to get ahead and start bringing in terms of encouraging people to start sleeping? If people had a lot of post-traumatic stress around that, you know, how do we prevent the lasting impacts of it? But I do think, you know, to the question of the big data and how do you turn that into smart, it is about when you start to see these trends over time, then you can then start going in and saying, let's try to fix it and let's try to do something with it, turning that understanding into action. And then you can start to see what works. And if you find something that works, then you can go, you know, put money, put scale, and really push it.
I think that's a really great insight. Big data has, maybe it's got more than two, but it certainly has two big uses. One is to figure out what's real, right? You know, we all believe that, you know, that juice is better for you than Coke, right? But we haven't been able to prove it either way, right? And we have lots of belief. We all believe if doctors have better data enablement, that their patients will be healthier. We believe these things, but for most things that we believe, we don't really know that they're real or not. And the scientist in us has this whole method that's been proven over and over. That's a hypothesis until proven otherwise. So big data can be a big piece of figuring out whether the hypothesis is true or not, or what exactly about it. It's not exactly true, but this piece of it is. And then the other piece of big data is, so that's a sort of scientific uber use of it. The next question is, now that you know that this is true, to do the interventional work, to do the behavioral change work, to do the work that nudges people into the direction that works better. Usually opt-in nudges work better in our world than not, but that's big data which leverages the knowledge as opposed to the hypothesis.
I think to your point, it's a critical piece to think about the user experience design, because smart data might be really smart insights, but if the user can't make any sense of the data, then they can't make that smart insight for them. And so you can do it in a lot of different ways, right? If it's simple behavioral changes, then designing a simple app that's with you all the time might make sense. If it's a really complex back-end system, then just designing a simple way for them to access the information if they only have limited technical skills, but an ability to really deep dive in if they have more technical skills. I think it's really critical to think about how you design the experience for the eventual users in order to make big data into small data.
So, I mean, listening to this conversation, it almost sounds like all the pieces exist or are existing, coming into existence, but that they haven't really been connected yet to enable users to be empowered over their health and their healthcare. What is the role of government, if at all, in this, in removing any policy barriers to kind of that type of integration happening, or providing incentives to accelerate that type of integration?
You don't have any politicians on the stage to jump right in there.
That's why I asked you partly.
Well, we see, I think what we've seen some early indications of that with mainly from a city level of people doing open government type of work. So the beginning to put data sets out, beginning to make it easier for you to understand how the city's operating and making those things available. It's much more complex. These things get complex because there's so much data that is, when you talk to people who work in government trying to put some of these data sets out, they don't know whether it's legal or not legal, right? And there's private data, especially around health, that's, you know, very, can be wrong in the wrong hands, be awful for a person, right? So there's a lot that needs to, we've found that there's a lot of education that needs to happen in the government systems themselves, with very clear policy that allows people to understand what I can release and what I can't release. And that locks a lot of behavior and potential behind closed doors that in some reasons should be there and others should not. But it's very hard for someone who works, a government employee, to negotiate that on their own. And so when people come in for requests from that, it moves around a bureaucracy that doesn't make it very effective.
I'll say that my answer sort of fits government into it. I'll say that the thing that really inspired me the first time I went to CGI was when President Clinton talked about shared values for shared value. And the idea that really everyone in this room coming together, including government, but different industries, that these problems that we're trying to solve are not really on any one of us to go solve, but they're on all of us to go solve, and figuring out how do we go leverage each other. And that there might be some technology in one place that we can go piece together with a marketing platform in another, and some money that might be sitting somewhere else, and actually go use that to get this stuff to happen faster. Because I think you're right, it is happening. The pieces are there for it to happen, but it's just not as fast as what's possible if we actually all work together. And so that's been really inspiring to me.
Well, and that leads to really part of the answer, or at least one of the answers to your question, which is that government is so 20th century, right? You said it backstage, right? We have a lot of our structures are around one doctor, one patient, one interaction, and never shall there be another mode, right? And that's not the way of 50 years from now. I don't know whether it'll be 5 or 10 or 40 years from now, but sooner or later, we're going to get most of the answers to most of our questions from something like a brand that we trust as opposed to a person that we trust, just like we have for everything else in the world. That doesn't mean you don't have a doctor-patient relationship, but if all I'm trying to do is say, should I have more Lasix or less, or should I change medicines, or is this bump worth worrying about, or whatever, those are, most of our interactions with doctors are consultative sorts of things. And the history of all consultation has turned into managed services, which has turned into software services, where there's always still a consultation base around. And that's what's going to happen in medicine. But we have all the protectionist states protecting doctors' rights, and all the, you can't have one doctor treat somebody in another state, and all kinds of legacy rules that make it hard to do telemedicine, make it hard to share that information and ask those questions.
I said some of our debates were still stuck in the 20th century, not the government. It's an important distinction.
It's 19th century, is it?
No, well, I don't know, maybe. I can't think of any, thankfully, that are that far behind. What you said, Peter, I think is a good segue into our question from Twitter, from Jackie. What role can social media networks play to advance big data translation and activate wellness? In some ways, this is the larger question than what we were talking about earlier with chronic diseases. Do any of you have thoughts on Jackie's question? Dane?
Well, I think that clearly we've already talked about that there's enough data in the social cloud to actually dictate micro-targeting, find people who are at risk, find out who's drinking a lot, who's smoking, who's potentially going to use a prescription drug. There's the other half of it too, that the new society works on social pressure, so trying to include that as behavioral reinforcement, getting people to make public commitments, sharing how much water they're drinking with their friends, and getting that social circle is actually a great way to move those first victories. To not include the social cloud in a plan is a really big mistake, because certainly the mass part of the market lives in that space, and that is the data space. So finding people and reinforcing it is certainly the easy ways to leverage it. Have it all.
Travis, I think you must have thought about this through Jawbone.
Yeah, I think it connects with what I was saying before, is we can use these connections, these things that we discover, and social platforms become the great way to drive a lot of that connection. One of the things that we do is when we've taken some of the stats, like what I shared around the Boston Marathon bombings, and put them up on Twitter and others, they end up spreading really quickly. And so those become, when people read it, things that they start understanding about themselves. We've had a stat that people who live 5 miles or more from house, on average, were getting 54 minutes less sleep than the people who live 1 mile away from home. So, as that spread and idea spreads, maybe some of those people are actually in searching for home and trying to decide where they're going to live. I've never thought about my home as being, other than schooling and others, that's part of my health. And so, I think that the social platforms become great ways to spread these ideas really quickly, and then also understand which ones are actually spreading better. Again, it's back to what markets well. If we phrase it this way, do more people talk about it versus another way?
I would say overall we're trying to make behavior change, right? Whether it's a doctor-patient trying to get somebody to lose weight or to treat their diabetes better or whatever, or whether it's a whole community smoking cessation or whatever it is, we're trying to drive for appropriate behavior change. And one of the mistakes all of us make is believing that whatever motivates us will motivate everyone else, right? So some people are social animals. Your father happens to be one, right? And some people are not. And some people are more motivated by the influence of others, and some people are more data-driven, and some people are more monetary-driven. We talk about salespeople as coin-operated. So when we built a platform for raising all boats in the healthcare space, we tried to make it so that it could either enable social media, or it could enable gamification, or it could enable rewards and coupons, or it could enable different, training and education and videos, because different people respond to different kinds of motivation and for different things. And I think we need to figure out which things make each individual person tick, which is different.
So in our last few minutes, and for a final question, I'd like for each of your reflections on what will this conversation be like in 5 years? Will we still be talking about multiple digital platforms, or will we be talking about one digital platform? Will we be talking about how the Internet of Things has penetrated every aspect of our lives, and then from our refrigerator to our car to our bed to our Jawbone are all equally informing kind of how we think about our health the next day? Will we be thinking about kind of gamification as being the ways in which kids really learn about health? I mean, what will this conversation be like in 5 years, and particularly how will it be different than the one that we've had here today? Peter, will you start?
I think that 20% of people will have a refrigerator that goes, you promised. And 20% of us will think that that's the most crazy thing on the whole planet Earth.
I think a lot of this conversation and the phase we've been over the past couple of years is this realization that this data is there and we can go do something with it. And so I think we're, over this next year, probably transitioning out of that and starting to figure out, okay, how do we go do something with that? How do we actually affect change in the world? And so in 5 years, I think we will be seeing what's working and seeing what's working really at scale and figuring out how do we put more effort behind that, and how do we constantly pivot to as life pivots around us, and how do we keep that balance going?
So to be honest, I have no idea. I feel like technology just advances at such a rapid pace and that's what makes it really exciting to be part of it. But if I were to posit a theory, I would say, it's amazing that these people here are working to make data more and more available. And so I think I'll be really excited to see, where are the niches that startups are able to make big differences in this conversation? Is it that the conversation has become more democratized? I think that'll be really interesting.
Dane?
I'm very hopeful, so I'll give you the sci-fi answer, because 5 years is not
Please.
very long. I'm hoping that in the future, data is sort of becoming ubiquity. It helps us inform decisions subtly, and we're all living a much better life because the powerful tools that have been created sort of level up the things that we need to change behaviorally. That we're starting to talk about higher level pattern recognition and how can we leverage this even further, but it's no longer a debate that people have to see the data, that every individual owns their own data and has it helping them. It's not just somewhere off in the cloud, that we're using it for our betterment, hopefully.
Michael?
So I think what I see in the horizon really is contextualization, and what I mean by that is as you move through the world digitally and potentially physically, things will change around you. So just as your car is going to have internet, operability soon, and your mobile phone has that, the data that you're emitting mingles with everyone else's, with your social media, all those things, and then helps you make decisions, points you in the right directions, and you're not doing it in a way that they're launching an app to do that. It just is. And so the contextualizing where you're at and that kind of ubiquity of experience, I think, would be a very powerful thing, and I think we're on the road to see that. So
big data becomes personalized smart data, and not scary for anyone of any age, and hopefully empowering for everyone. Please thank our panelists and thank all of you for joining us.